So with Elvis, there was absolutely no structure. So she had to go back to her mom's house in LA for school. And she would go there during the school year, and then she would go to Graceland over the summer, and she hated it. She's like, I felt like a part of me was dying when I was away from Graceland.
And it's like in Graceland, she was allowed to do anything. There was no rules. She remembers as young as 4, like screaming at the chef, "Well, I'll get you fired." She talks about like driving those golf courses. Like they would just break them. They would run into the fence. They would mess up the pool. They would mess up the grass. And the next day it would just be magically fixed. And if anybody told her no, she would say, "I'm going to tell my dad what you said." And from the time she was young, she knew she had all this power that no adult could tell her no. She was allowed to do whatever she wanted. And her father like loved that. He gave her all the power in the world to act this way. Meanwhile, she didn't love Vernon, Elvis's dad. I couldn't get away with much when Vernon was around. He was more of an authoritative figure to me. I wasn't close to him. I would avoid him at all costs. I wish I had a different relationship with my grandfather. I just kind of hid from him.
And so again, there's this feeling where you're like, well, you did need to go to your mom's house. And at this point, you don't know how bad things were with Priscilla. So it's just like, I don't know, this is like a bad way to raise someone.
She also remembers that anytime she got hurt, her dad would get mad at her. One time she like went over the golf course and ripped up her knee, and he slapped her on the hand as a punishment. And he said, "Don't get hurt. That upsets me." Or one time she went to the doctor with an earache and was screaming from the pain, and Elvis had to leave the room. And she's like, that's how much she loved me. He couldn't even be there for me when I was in pain. He was really mad when I got in pain because he loved me so much.
It is hard hearing how like idealized and obviously fucked up situation is.
Once the gates get closed, Graceland was like a city of its own jurisdiction. My dad was the chief of police and everybody was ranked. There were a few laws and rules, but mostly not. She goes, I used to run over people's feet with the golf cart and take off. One day I was tearing up the backyard with the cart and someone told me to stop doing it. And I said, I'll tell my father on you when he wakes up. Another time somebody told me that I couldn't do something when I was on the golf cart. And I said, I'll tell my father that your wife. I wish I could remember what it was I said his wife had done. I was wild.
She was kind of a terror. There were people who would wait at the gates trying to get photos of Elvis, and she would say, like, give me your camera and $20 and I'll go inside and take a photo for you. And she would go inside and just like take a picture of a wall and bring back their camera and take $20. Or she would throw their camera into a bush.
Because my dad slept all day, I was on the run. And she talks about how she would just like run amok all day with no supervision. And then every once in a while, an adult would come find her and say, your dad wants to see you. And she would like report to his room, and she loved it. She felt so special to get to go see him. And one time she went up and he had gotten 3 rings, one for her that was diamonds, one that was rubies for her friends, and one that was sapphire for the other friends. And that's just how he was. She was allowed to do whatever she wanted, and then he would give her gifts. So she's just talking about all the different people who lived in Graceland, like Aunt Delta, Patsy, all these people who tried to help take care of her. But there were times when I would eat French fries for 3 days straight, or I wouldn't take a bath for 10 days. Eventually, my dad would wake up and I'd get the call that I was to go upstairs because he wanted to see me. I always loved that call. I'd go and hang out with him in his room. He didn't really leave often. Isn't that crazy?
It's crazy that this was the good parent.
And it's so crazy that even looking back in her 50s as a mother, she's like, it just wasn't fair that I'd have to go home to my mom. She would make me go to school. I'm like, you can't possibly think that this was like survivable. And she looks back a lot on like how lucky they were. And even Riley's childhood, they were so dangerous. Just like giving everybody golf carts, giving everybody electric scooters, and just saying, sled down the hill on your fucking golf cart, see what happens. And a lot of times they would tip over and topple. And she says at one point her brother, she uses the word decapitated his own golf cart, but he came out fine. I'm like, it is by the grace of God that no children died.
That is what is so interesting, is like being older and looking back on this and not being like, wow, it's really shocking that any of this was like okay back then. Different times. But instead she's like, anyway, now my kids don't have to go to school.
And then here's my last crazy story from this young. Sorry, if you want to hear every crazy story about growing up in Graceland, I guess you could buy the book yourself. This one gets me. He always had my back. I was friends with one of the neighborhood girls and I spent the night at her house. As I was leaving the next morning, her next door neighbor, an older woman who was watering her lawn in her bathrobe, knew who I was and started calling me names and bad-mouthing my dad to me, saying he thinks he's the king of everything. I had never heard someone talk badly about him like that, and it affected me. When I got home, I told my dad what had happened, and he goes, where does she live? I told him, and he said, let's go. We drove up to her house, and he got out and walked up to her, fully decked out in one of his outfits. I saw them talk for a few minutes, and by the end, she had asked him to sign a record for her, and they took a smiling picture together. That's the kind of daddy he was. I am like, what, self-serving? What did that do for you? I was like, I don't know. That's such an interesting story to be like, isn't he a great dad? Somebody said something bad about him, and he went and he fixed it for himself.
Yeah.
It's interesting that the king of pop, Elvis Presley, one of the most popular men on earth at the time, couldn't handle hearing some little old lady mowing her yard didn't like him. I
was very disturbed by her retelling of her childhood as idyllic.
And I see it a lot in Riley. Riley's like, we had a perfect childhood. I'm like, your mom has been married to 5 people already. That couldn't have been good.
It could not have been great. And then Riley writes about going to visit Graceland during her life and how they would just hang out upstairs in Elvis's room while tours happened downstairs. And her mom going every year for Elvis's candlelit vigil. And she saw someone dressed as Elvis hugging her mom. The fan was there every year, so I recognized her. But this time, I was really watching their interaction. I became keenly aware of my mom's body language in a different way, I guess because I was older. And the way my mom surrendered in this woman's arms broke my heart. In that moment, I saw so clearly that she was searching for a parent. To over 20 years after his death, be like finding solace in his super fans is like very devastating.
I think it speaks to the fact that there was not one adult in her life.
Yeah.
That she could look to lean on and trust.
Mm-hmm.
And so just to have an older woman give you a hug and you're like, oh, somebody who cares. The other weird backdrop of living at Graceland is the security threats. She's like, every once in a while, there'd be a threat that some superfan had gotten onto the property and was going to kidnap me, and they would have to ring the alarm and I'd have to go into hiding. A security guard would grab me. And this goes on through Riley's childhood even. Lisa, of course, and especially later when she's married to Michael Jackson, they have to walk around with 10 security guards at all times, and that they would get letters. Like, I don't think they realize, and I guess I know they don't realize how fucking crazy it is to grow up as a little kid knowing that at any given moment, somebody might snatch you and want to kill you. I think all kids grow up a little bit afraid of
stranger danger.
Yeah, I mean, nobody wants to get kidnapped. I think we all know that's bad.
People aren't regularly getting letters and having active threats against their safety.
Graceland just brought mayhem. My dad would get bored riding around the place, so sometimes he would say to me, get in the golf cart with 8, 9, 10 cars behind us. And he would lead the convoy right out the front gate onto Elvis Presley Boulevard and down the street.
Leaving Graceland and flying out of Memphis International Airport back to LA was true emotional trauma for me. As soon as I got out of the car in Memphis, though, I would completely transform. I never wanted to leave.